I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about the MH17 Joint Investigation Team's latest report or results from the investigation. What MH17 happened what year, Alexander? Was it 2015?
It was July 2014.
14.
So this is 5 years now. We're now in July 2019. This investigation was set up almost immediately. I remember the discussion which took place in the Security Council, where it was mentioned that this investigation was being created. By the way, I should say this is not the investigation that was authorized by the Security Council. That was a different investigation set up by the Dutch Safety Board. This is an investigation that was originally initiated by Ukraine, and which the Netherlands and Malaysia joined, which is why it's called the Joint Investigation Team. It is fronted by the Dutch, but it was set up in July 2014, within days of MH17 being shot down, and it has now come up with its first suspects 5 years after the event.
And the main takeaway here is that though they've named some suspects, which you'll get into it a little bit later in this video, aren't much of a surprise. The big surprise that I got from this story is that the Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, came up with this gem of a quote, which just throws the whole JIT, the Joint Investigation Team's work, on its head. And here's his quote, Alexander. I'll read it to you. And I'm citing local media in Malaysia as I read you this quote. "We are very unhappy. From the very beginning, it became a political issue on how to accuse Russia of wrongdoing. Even before they examined the case, they have already claimed it. The shooting down of MH17 was done by Russia." What do you make of that quote from the Malaysian Prime Minister?
Well, the first thing to say is that it in effect repudiates the findings, these preliminary findings of the Joint Investigation Team, because what he is saying is he's very unhappy with them, which is, almost saying that he doesn't accept them. And he then goes on to say, I think elsewhere, that he hasn't actually seen any evidence.
He actually says, can I read you that quote? I actually have it here. Yes. He actually says that there is no proof, only hearsay.
Only hearsay. And in fact, here I think I will touch on what the Joint Investigation Team has done in naming these suspects. The people it's named are 4 people who were actively involved in the Donbass insurgency in the spring and summer of 2014. One is a person who is always referred to in the Western media and by the Ukrainians as Girkin, but Russians all know him by his nom de guerre, which is Strelkov. Strelkov was the defense minister of the Donetsk People's Republic for a period in 2014, and many people in Russia and in the Donbass still think of him as a hero because of his defense of an East Ukrainian town called Slavyansk from the Ukrainian army. Now, what the Joint Investigation Team have said is that Strelkov, I will call him Strelkov rather than Girkin.
Strelkov, because I think our international audience, at least I know him as Strelkov as well from my readings.
Exactly. But to be very clear, Girkin is probably his actual name. But as a Strelkov is the name I know him by, and most people I think know him by. Strelkov undoubtedly was the major military leader at the time when MH17 was shot down. But the Joint Investigation Team doesn't say that he gave any orders to shoot down MH17 or gave any orders which led to MH17 being shot down. And the same applies to these 3 other people who were, also prominent leaders at that time. What it basically says is they were in a position of authority. They must have been implicated in some way in smuggling this this missile system from Russia, which supposedly shot down MH17. The Joint Investigation Team insists that this missile system was smuggled in from Russia. The Russians categorically denied that, but that's the theory. The joint investigative team, the JIT, has accepted. So they say, these people must have known about that, must have been involved in that decision, and that somehow makes them responsible and therefore guilty. And they've sort of gingered up that theory, which, I mean, to me looks very, very much like a theory, by releasing these two transcripts of telephone conversations that were had at this time. One with Sergei Aksyonov, who is the head of the government, the local government in Crimea, which is now, of course, a Russian government, and which was a Russian government then, in which they asked for help with anti-aircraft systems. And another, which was supposedly had with a man called Vladislav Surkov, who is a very important and close aide of Vladimir Putin. Now, I should say that the second of those transcripts, the conversation with Surkov, it is denied by the man who had it, Borodai, that it actually took place, and that a lot of people in Russia are saying it's almost certainly a fake. But having said that, even those transcripts don't actually refer, as far as I can see, to anything that is pertinent to the shooting down of MH17. So I have to ask myself this question. I mean, 5 years of investigation, and we've come up with nothing that couldn't have been said back in 2014, if you accept the theory that it was indeed the Russians or the Russian-backed insurgents in eastern Ukraine who shot down MH17. No wonder Mr. Mahathir says that he's unhappy, and no wonder the Malaysians are unhappy, because it doesn't seem to me as if there's any progress really being made at all. And the other thing the Joint Investigation Team said was that they actually don't have any evidence yet that would implicate any actual Russian military officials, any serving members of the Russian armed forces in this affair. Many people were expecting that they would name names, and in the event they didn't. So it all looks, frankly, very threadbare, and that does point towards Mr. Mahathir's complaint that this is in fact an investigation intended to place responsibility on Russia, rather than one that was objectively carried out in order to determine the truth. And Alex, how often have we appeared on programs on the Duran in which we have complained that in investigation in which the suspect, or rather not the suspect, the guilty party is named before the investigation actually even begins, is an investigation that has been fatally compromised from the outset. We've seen this in Syria, we've seen this with the Salisbury affair, and now Mr. Mahathir is complaining that the same thing happened with MH17, and it should not surprise us.
Yeah, the narrative is always the same. The pattern is always the same, Alexander. Like you said, with Syria, it was within hours that, it was Assad did it. Within hours. How do we know? Well, we know anonymous sources, social media, Twitter, YouTube. The same thing, with the Skripal case. We know within hours, we know it was Russia.
Yeah.
How do we know?
Yes.
YouTube, Twitter, anonymous sources. The same thing with Iran that's going on right now as we are doing this video. It is literally the same thing. How do we know that, Iran attacked those oil tankers? Oh, we know anonymous sources, social media, blah, blah, blah. The same thing. It's the same playbook that they use over and over again. And they used that playbook with MH17. I remember John Kerry, hours after the tragedy happened, it was Russia. It was, it was the Donbass. It was, these rebels. They call them the rebels. They did it. How do we know? Twitter, YouTube, anonymous sources. But
Exactly.
Alexander, we know who did this. I mean, not we. I'm saying the world. Russia knows who did this. The U.S. knows who did this.
Of course.
Why are they gingering up this report? And how come we just don't get to the truth of the matter? Because if you ask me, the Malaysian Prime Minister is calling it straight. Good on him. Bravo on him. He's calling it straight. He's calling out BS. He's saying this is BS. Let's just get to the bottom of it and just finally get some damn truth on this thing.
Well, of course, I mean, the first thing to do in an investigation of this kind is not to involve those people who have an interest in the outcome. Now, that includes both the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians were excluded, but the Ukrainians were involved. That already is a problem. But, I mean, to give you another example of how this investigation has gone badly wrong, the JIT now says that they want to talk to these people. They want to interview these people who they say are suspects. Of course, that's absolutely right. That's what they should have done in 2014. If this had been a properly conducted investigation, that's the very first thing they should have done. They should have sent teams of people out to Russia, to Ukraine, to the Donbass, and interviewed all the people who were directly involved in this affair. That would have certainly have included Strelkov. It would certainly have included his aides. It would have included the people on the Ukrainian side. It would have included people on the Russian side. That's how an investigation is conducted. You then look at the logs because of the military units involved. Now, maybe the insurgents don't keep accurate logs, but the Russian military do, and so presumably does the Ukrainian military. You ask to see the logs. You ask to look at the communications logs that pass between these various military units and the various commanders. You check all the satellite data. The Russians provided satellite data. Bellingcat questioned that satellite data. The people who created the software Bellingcat used to challenge the Russian satellite data say Bellingcat got it wrong.
Didn't even go to you. I don't even think he stepped foot in Ukraine ever in his life, these guys.
Well, I know. Well, I mean, that's the other thing, because I mean,
it's ridiculous.
You mentioned social media, and of course, social media was used to a great extent to try and prove that the Russians smuggled this missile system across the border into Ukraine. And who was it who brought all that information together, relying on social media to a great extent? It was Bellingcat. So, of course, you need to go beyond relying on social media or on, enthusiasts in London or in England rather to do that kind of investigation. If you're a professional investigator, you do this, you go and look at the evidence. They didn't do that. And of course, they didn't do that in Russiagate when they didn't look at the DNC servers. They relied on other people, on private contractors in that case, to do the investigation for them. It seems that in some of the Syrian chemical weapons attacks, they went to outside contractors also. And whatever your view about these events, whoever you think is responsible, and we all have our theories, I mean, that shouldn't. The priority always is to get these things looked at and investigated properly so we find out the truth. Now, if I can just touch on Bellingcat, one thing I would say is that the earlier report that was done by the Dutch Safety Board actually revealed that Western intelligence agencies were reporting to Western governments right up to the moment when MH17 was shot down, the Ukrainian insurgents, the militias there, did not have sophisticated missiles. It's in the report of the Dutch Safety Board. Yeah.
You make a good point, because the Duma attack in Syria, the reason that fell apart so quickly, and now it's pretty much accepted fact that it was a hoax, is because you had not only investigators there, but you also had journalists who were at the scene, and they were able to interview people on the ground, not using social media. Can you imagine using Twitter to get to the truth of something?
Yes.
I mean, that is about as absurd as I can think of. You know, Duma was solved because you had people on the ground asking those questions.
Yeah, well, indeed, exactly. I mean, this is the point. But you also have to ask the right people. I mean, the Dutch investigators and, of course, the Ukrainian investigators did send people on the ground. They just went around the various villages and towns in eastern Ukraine, which are under Ukrainian control, and said to them, did you see anything that might have looked like a book missile system? And you always find some people who will say, yes, I did. But those are not... Yeah, those are not proper witnesses. Yeah. As I said, the proper witnesses are the people who were actually involved.
Exactly.
And that includes people like Strelkov.
Exactly.
To actually ask to interview Strelkov 5 years after the event is extraordinary. And if this had been a properly conducted inquiry by an impartial investigator, say someone from India. I mean, there was an investigation which I thought was a very well conducted investigation into an incident that happened in Syria. And it was striking that the investigator, the leader of that investigation team, which was created by the United Nations, was an Indian army officer who had no axe to grind. If you had a properly conducted, genuinely impartial investigation, they would have gone to see all of those various people. They'd have taken evidence from them. As I said, they'd have looked at the logs. They'd have looked at the communications records. They would have looked, by the way, at the TV pictures, because both Russian and Ukrainian television were actively covering the events in eastern Ukraine. And I believe, I mean, I haven't seen these films, but I believe that Ukrainian television was showing Ukrainian military deploying book missile systems in the Donbass at that time. Now, I don't know what the relevance of that is, but you can ask people. They never did. They never went, and they never asked those questions. And instead, 5 years later, we're told that possible suspects are these four people who, as I said, if the only evidence against them is the positions they were occupying in the militia back in 2014. Well, you don't know anything more then, more now about them, it seems, than you knew then. So you could have announced back in 2014 that they were suspects. Why wait 5 years?
Yeah, no wonder the mainstream media is not really covering this too much, because there's nothing there, really. But
well, that's it. I mean, there is nothing there. I think they were very disappointed, actually. Yeah. I think they were expecting more, and I think that they felt and they feel very let down by an announcement that had been trailed in advance as, being a big news announcement, and I think they're very disappointed.
Yeah, they got let down. What do you make of the timing of this? Because you have right now going on, you have Ukraine, Biden, Hillary Clinton, election meddling and a soft coup against Trump. And Ukraine is heavily implicated in this. You have Zelensky as the new president of Ukraine, and Zelensky did say that he would like to begin dialogues with the East. He did say that. He hinted at it.
Well, indeed.
He did hint at it.
And we've just received news that the Ukrainian parliament has been dissolved, and there will be Ukrainian parliamentary elections coming up very soon. I have to say, I don't think the timing of this is at all an accident.
You also have Zelensky in Germany, if I could just
absolutely
jump in there. You had him in Germany as well, which I think may even play a role.
Absolutely. And there was a decision also by the European Union to roll over sanctions. All of this has happened at about this time. And I think the reason this is all happening and the way that it is firstly, there's growing concern in some Western capitals that there is a softening of the line against Russia in Ukraine, that the new parliamentary elections are going to result in a runaway victory for Zelensky's party and for the pro-Russian party in Ukraine, which is getting stronger, by the way. And I think also there is concern that in European capitals, in Western European capitals, there is increasing dissatisfaction with this whole policy of confronting Russia over Ukraine. So I think this decision was brought out 5 years after the event in order basically to lock everyone in to this narrative of Russia as the aggressor in Ukraine, shooting down civilian airliners, killing hundreds of people, and to make sure that there is no softening of the line on against Russia in Ukraine, and to remind Zelensky himself that, we are there, we are your allies, you mustn't talk to these bad Russian people who did this terrible thing. So I think that is probably the reason for the timing of this thing, because it does actually look very rushed with an announcement that was made, which is frankly so lacking in substance that it feels incomplete.
Right. Very good point. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on that notifications bell and smash that like button. That really helps us out a lot. Follow us on Instagram, theduran_com. Go to our website, theduran.com. And please donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and now Subscribestar. That also helps us out a lot. And of course, you can get an audio copy of this video. Follow us on iTunes and on Soundcloud as well. Alexander, we have an ebook which people can download on Brexit, and we're going to have a couple of ebooks on Russiagate. You wrote the foreword to the Brexit one. Do you want to say a quick word on perhaps the Russiagate ones that we are going to come out with?
Well, indeed, because this is, to my mind, by the way, Brexit and Russiagate are very similar stories, because what they are is both establishment attempts to overturn democratic votes, a referendum in Britain, a presidential election in the United States. And the establishments in Britain and the United States have attempted to do that in slightly different ways. In Britain, they've used the parliamentary machinery and the courts to try and stop it. In the United States, they've conjured up this massive conspiracy theory about the Russians having somehow been in league with Donald Trump to get him elected, with Donald Trump as the sort of Russian Siberian candidate, and therefore not the legitimate president of the American people. Anyway, what we do in these two books is we just deconstruct these narratives that have been created by the establishments of the United States and Britain around these two events, and especially in Russiagate, which is an incredibly complicated story. I mean, all conspiracy theories are complicated, but Russiagate is, off the scale in terms of its complexity. There's this huge cast of people who have been brought in. There's all these very strange complications of, legal actions and indictments and allegations that have swirled around, and anonymous sources planting stories in the media. What we do in our books on Russiagate, as we've done in our book on Brexit, is we show that behind all this maze of facts, this fog of stories, the truth is very simple. There was a democratic election. There's no reason to suspect anything particularly bad was done, at least by Donald Trump and his campaign. The only people who did bad things were those who didn't want him to be elected, and when he was elected, tried to set that vote aside. And they did that by creating this extraordinary narrative, which we set out in our book to refute.
All right. And you can also go to the Duran shop to pick up a t-shirt, a polo shirt, a long sleeve shirt, and a mug. Very, very quickly, Alexander, 10 seconds. The Duran shop, what should people buy?
They should buy all these things. I mean, you're wearing the polo shirt, and you can confirm how great it is, and people can see the double-headed eagle, our logo on your shirt. It's on my T-shirt also,
That's
my
right.
wonderful
Your long sleeve.
sleeve T-shirt. And they can drink from these fantastic magic mugs, which also have our logo, which are beautifully made. They're high-quality mugs. These are not cheap mugs, cheaply made mugs at all. They are really good quality, and they are great for drinking tea, which is what I'm drinking from this mug at the moment. Royal blend tea, the kind of tea that Edward VII used to drink, formulated for him by Fortnum and Masons in London.
Royal blend. Very nice.
Well,
All right. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Until next time, everybody. Take care.